Angela Daly from University of Dundee in Scotland. We do have a special seminar series that is starting today, and which has been organized by Lloyd Hill. So he is online because he's been quite ill, unfortunately, but I'm going to hand over to him to be able to introduce the seminar series, and then I'll introduce the speaker for the day. So to hand over to Dr. Hill.
Thank you, Claire. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this first in a series of 4 seminars, hopefully 5. I've got one more lined up potentially, but more news on that later. And a very big welcome to Angela, and thank you for opening our series and for making it sufficiently broad to justify the kind of the general title there, social implications of generative AI. You'll notice that the subsequent seminars that we've got lined up at the moment are more focused on the university context, which is my particular interest at the moment, being on sabbatical, but I think possibly also for most of you attending here. So just to draw your attention quickly to what we have lined up, our next seminar on the 19th of September will be a cross-faculty roundtable discussion. We have 3 speakers lined up there. And on 26th of September, we're looking at generative AI in the humanities, and the 4th, hopefully the second last in the series, will look specifically at generative AI and undergraduate reading and writing, a very contentious issue, as you're all aware. Right, that's it. Thank you, everybody, and over to you, Angela.
Thanks so much, Lloyd, for introducing that. So, yes, I will introduce the speakers today, Angela Daly, whom, incidentally, we met at a conference last year in September. It's called the International Initiative for the Promotion of Political Economy, which was in Madrid, Spain. So no one really goes to conferences in Madrid for the academics. It's really just to go and drink wine and eat tapas in Madrid, which there was a lot of it. But the great thing is that I did meet Angela because we were on the same panel, which was called Law and Political Economy. So when Angela messaged to say she's coming to Cape Town, I introduced her to Lloyd, who is interested in this topic. So things worked out really well. So to introduce Professor Angela Daly, she is what described as an international leader in the regulation and governance of new digital technologies and in the theory and practice of knowledge exchange. She is a professor of law and technology at the University of Dundee, and she does a lot of practical and applied work, advising, working on research teams, really applying the theoretical and legal research to how states should actually deal with the issues and the implications of data, of public data, and of ownership. So really cutting edge research. So thank you so much for presenting at our seminar series. I'll turn on the slideshow over here. And then just to reiterate, it's a 40-minute presentation from you to 45, and then Q&A. So you can move your, everything's there. It's recording. Everyone can hear online. So please begin.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks for a great introduction. And thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here in general, and also specifically to be opening the series on the social implications of generative AI. And I hope I can attend some more, unfortunately, online this time because I'm leaving South Africa next week. But yeah, it's really, really great to be here. Thank you so much. And thanks very much to Claire for cheering and organising, as well as Lloyd online. As Claire mentioned, I'm actually a legal academic overall. I work kind of in socio-legal studies, which is kind of the intersection of law and it's a good question what socio-legal studies actually is, but some would say it's the use of kind of legal methods as well as social science methods, could be qualitative, quantitative. Some say it's kind of taking insights from social sciences, more generally, particularly sociology. I guess I kind of work across both aspects of it. But today I'm going to be talking, I guess, more from a social policy perspective, perhaps, with, as Claire mentioned, some of the work that I've been doing around data and AI with various policymakers. And also, yes, I mean, I'm not sure, I have to say in law, we're not very good on theory. We're actually not good at theory or at methods. I wouldn't say that in the law school. I have been visiting the law school here actually this last couple of weeks and been talking with people there about some of these issues from more kind of strictly legalistic perspectives. So I'm hoping that I'm doing something that's a little bit more interesting and accessible to you, who I guess are sociologists or social anthropologists, but there's also a more sort of legalistic take on some of this. So maybe you can see that I was preparing the slides last minute because I don't know what generative AI is. It should be generative AI. So I'm going to talk a little bit, especially because this is the first in the series, and I don't assume that people actually know what AI is. In fact, there's quite a big problem that people don't really know what AI is when it comes to discourses around artificial intelligence. And in fact, we are seeing specifically in the UK, there's been a whole lot of hype around artificial intelligence and the naming and defining of certain technologies that are not actually AI as AI in order to kind of buy into this hype or kind of get government money or funding or from private investors. So actually, I kind of want to talk a little bit about what AI actually is and kind of where the data comes from that powers AI, and that my presentation is going to be looking more at that particular point as I go, but I will refer to some of the broader issues around artificial intelligence, and I guess particularly the issues about the sources of data. I'm going to talk about some practical work that I've been engaged in Scotland, the UK and European Union policy initiatives around data, which could be used for training AI, but could be used for other purposes. And I'm trying to kind of head towards a bit more of a theoretical understanding of what publicness is in data, although I'm not sure I'm really going to have a good comment. I reread the description I gave to hope I can fulfill some of the things I said I was going to do, but I do feel I'm kind of pointing out perhaps more of the problems and some practical solutions, but the theoretical solutions I think are maybe the next stage, which I may comment a bit more on as we go. Okay, so to talk about AI first, like what is AI or what is generative AI? Has anyone played around with anything, well, like ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion? A few people are nodding. What about like Sumo for music? Has anyone? Okay, I actually only, I played some Sumo creations I gave a presentation to the law staff and students on a very similar topic to this yesterday, and there's actually a lawsuit over, I should have brought it out for this too, in fact, but Sumo is basically a generative AI for music, and it's being sued on the basis of copyright infringement for songs that it has produced that basically relating to certain prompts that extremely eerily mimic, for instance, Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You, and also ABBA songs as well. So actually, as a treat, maybe later on, I'll play you that and you can see how freakishly like the actual, the real versions it is. Anyway, so some of you, if you've played around with this generative AI, which you can get for images, which you can get for text, which you can get for music, you'll sort of see, you'll know how it works. You put in various prompts and it kind of comes out with a finished product based on your prompts. And there's a lot of discussion that I'm sure you'll be having in some of the subsequent seminars around these outputs, around kind of how good or not they are. ChatGPT in particular has been criticized for its hallucinations, where it's kind of making stuff up. And certainly in the legal field, we've seen ChatGPT used, including by some practicing lawyers, which is a bit concerning. And it basically they've used ChatGPT to create briefs, and it's cited cases that don't actually exist. So that's an example of a hallucination. So there's a lot of discussion around that. For the images, and I actually made this image. I played around with Stable Diffusion myself yesterday, and I asked for like visiting professor or researcher giving a talk at the University of Stellenbosch Sociology department. So I guess that's what it thinks you all are. And the speaker is a ghost for some reason. There's no speaker. And I think if you look very carefully, there's some very odd sort of faces, people's bodies that don't quite like look like a body. I think in one, a face was sort of, you know, distorted. And these kind of Stable Diffusion, I think, has been accused, or you can see perhaps some of the pictures that it comes out with, where people have got like 2 hands joined together or 10 fingers on a hand or something like that. So you, some of these generative AIs work better than others or produce more accurate content than others. But okay, so some of you are familiar with what they are. What generative AI is AI that can create content of some sort in response to a user's prompt or request. So if you do use them, you put in some words. I put in, as I mentioned, sort of visiting researcher, Stellenbosch University Sociology seminar, and that's kind of what it comes out with. Again, this is not the law seminar, but interesting from a legal perspective, at least IBM, that's their definition, their use of the word original, because there's a whole kind of debate about how original or not is the output. And that has significance actually from a copyright perspective, because from copyright's perspective, you could have copyright over original works or content. So there's also questions that we won't go into at the moment anyway, around sort of the originality, and much bigger questions too around, you know, the use of other materials, whether AI itself or not can be termed a creator, et cetera, et cetera. So some of these I will actually come back to, but that's what that's like the best definition I could find of generative AI. But it does beg the question, like, what is actually AI in the first place? As generative AI is a form of artificial intelligence. And what I've kind of, especially for my talk yesterday, was looking at was definitions, kind of definitive definitions from law and policy, particularly because that was a talk about law, about what kind of artificial intelligence actually is. And this has been quite significant because the European Union is actually introducing a law to regulate artificial intelligence. And you have to kind of define what it is you're going to regulate before doing regulating. So what's the law actually going to apply to? And interestingly, so the legislation was finalized earlier this year. It won't come into force until 2026, but there was a big issue. They thought they had a good definition of AI, and then generative AI kind of emerged in a big way, and they realized that the kind of working definition they had before the text was finalized wouldn't properly take account of generative AI. So they actually had to update the definition in the new law in order to include that as well. Sorry, I haven't been moving enough, perhaps. And also I was looking at some UK policies. But I think the important thing to kind of emphasize is that the definitions that we as in the UK or in Europe have so far have kind of emphasized 2 aspects of machine systems, which seem to lead to it being defined as artificial intelligence. So both the adaptability of systems and the autonomy of systems, so that it's not clear if you are the creator of the AI system or the developer. The kind of adaptability and autonomy of the system means that it's not entirely clear you know how the system is actually going to work. And that seems to be a kind of motif of artificial intelligence, that perhaps unlike other machine systems or automated systems, the final outcomes are not clear from the beginning. So that causes a lot of complications in legally speaking, actually, in terms of things like attributing liability or responsibility or accountability as well for the systems. If an AI sort of causes harm to somebody, like injures them, whose fault is it? So lawyers are continue to talk about that to a great degree, and as well as kind of not really being able to easily predict how the system is going to work or what results the system is going to produce. There's also kind of aspects that the system, from the autonomy perspective as well, that the system seems to kind of have some sort of life or mind of its own that is kind of goes beyond or is distinct from what its creators wanted or intended for it. So these two aspects, and I think there's probably going to be a much more complex explanation of what they mean from the more technical perspective, but at least these two aspects seem to have been replicated in some definitions that are being used more in the law and policy field, at least in the EU and the UK. And I think these are kind of important aspects in terms of the impact that AI can have on societies and economies that is not as easily foreseeable as perhaps some other technologies, and also issues around sort of responsibility, accountability, and so on. Okay, so I did want to kind of talk about that because sometimes we're not, AI is used to describe many things, but not always clear exactly, what it means. All right, so how does it work? And again, I should have given the caveat, I'm not a technical expert, as you might have gathered already. So this is a fairly kind of non-technical description, but I think the definition is important to kind of understand some of the features, but how do the systems actually work, and in a sort of practical way, and what kind of materials do they need to function? So to make artificial intelligence, particularly a model, I think it's a term that is used, like a machine learning model, you need to have a large amount of data in the first place that the model can be trained on. And this is a photo or an example of how if you were sort of scanning that as a human can tell that some of these are Chihuahua dogs and some of them are muffins, right? So you might have to look kind of carefully, but they do, when you put them together, it's like, okay, actually they do look strangely similar, but they would be distinct to kind of human eyes, but not necessarily sort of machine eyes if they were sort of scanning things like the colors, for instance. You might not really be able to tell from that perspective which one is a dog and which one is a baked good. So artificial intelligence systems need, for instance, if it was a system that was needed to tell the difference between Chihuahuas and muffins, it would need to be trained on a lot of data, so images of the two, so that it could begin to kind of understand what the distinctions actually are from a sort of machine perspective. And it needs a lot of data in order to do this, and it, in theory, becomes better and better at making the distinction and functioning with that training data. And that data allows them to recognize patterns, to determine like what is a Chihuahua and what is a muffin, and also make predictions if it's then given some image that it hasn't been trained on. It's not, is it a muffin? Is it a Chihuahua? It can use that body of data that it's been trained on, and the kinds of, I think heuristics is probably the term, rules of thumb to understand. Usually Chihuahuas are maybe less circular than the muffin, and they maybe don't have so much purple content as well. So these would be the kinds of things that it could use to predict whether another image was of a Chihuahua or a muffin or something else. And the more data it kind of gets trained on, the better, in theory, in terms of making those distinctions and predictions. Now, the crux of my talk is really going to look at where does this data come from and kind of who benefits from it. And the data can come from various sources to train AI models. So a lot of the big artificial intelligence companies have a lot of data themselves. I mean, some of them are in partnership with the big technology companies or are subsidiaries of those companies. So for instance, like Microsoft, Google, Meta or Facebook, Amazon all have kind of AI divisions, And they also have enormous amounts of data about their own customers, and also for those that operate marketplaces, about advertisers and other smaller businesses that may use, for instance, the Amazon marketplace. So if you're a big tech company, you will have a lot of internal data, and that can then be used to train AI models that you might be creating. Not everyone has all that data, and especially for smaller companies in particular, they might actually look to external sources for data that they can either buy in the context of third party. So they might buy data from a data broker, they might buy it actually from a tech company. So both Reddit and X, which used to be known as Twitter, are charging for access now to the data that they hold about customers and from their analytics that then, another company could access potentially for money that they could then use to train their own AI. Another source of data is actually open data sets. Many governments make some data that they collect openly available. I believe that does happen in South Africa, although people can tell me if I'm wrong. It certainly happens quite a lot in the UK and Europe where I'm based. We also get open data from academia. So have any of you done research projects, maybe where you've produced some data and then you've made it available online somewhere? Has anyone done that? Few people have, maybe. So in fact, some funding bodies actually require that to be the case for instance, for the purposes of reproducibility and replicability of data, as well as, especially if the funding body is a public funder, from the perspective of the funding comes from the public. So data should be coming out of that work should be publicly available. So there's various open data sets as well. And there's also a rather more dubious process of scraping data from the internet. So data that is kind of accessible on the internet, whether it could be of people's faces, in fact, so photos, other forms of kind of textual data, which are on internet sites. Some AI companies have been scraping that data to feed into their AI models. And in my talk yesterday, we had a long discussion about the legality of that or not. There are definitely issues from an IP perspective, intellectual property, as well as a privacy perspective with regards to that practice, which are currently kind of going through courts and regulatory bodies. But I can talk more about that if people are interested. But the data is very key because, I mean, there's this kind of adage from the computer science world of garbage in, garbage out of systems, which I quite like, actually, because I think it kind of demonstrates quite viscerally that if you don't have particularly good quality data going into a system or information going into a system, you're not going to get good functioning of the system later on. And that has become kind of quite important when it comes to kind of some of the problems and concerns around artificial intelligence and the data that it's based on. So we've already seen with some artificial intelligence systems like facial recognition technologies, where you have sometimes in real time a camera with facial recognition scanning public areas or private areas, and it links to a database of faces that have been on some sort of, well, sometimes they've been labeled with identified, sometimes not, and it can compare the face of people that it is scanning with this database. And does anyone know if this has been used in South Africa or not, like by the police? Oh, private security. Yep. So it's been used by police forces in some countries, including in England specifically. But there's been, and it's in some parts of the US as well, in fact. But there's been huge concerns around facial recognition technology, both in terms of well, how it is being used and where. For instance, in England, it's been used quite controversially in lower income areas and areas with large Black populations, not so much in higher income areas and areas with large white populations. So it seems to be very kind of targeted in a problematic way, but also the actual technology itself is viewed as being not particularly good at identifying certain groups of people. So misidentification, not only is it being used, in my opinion, in some quite problematic ways, but also the technology itself is viewed as being biased and particularly bad at identifying women or non-binary people compared to men, and people with darker skin tones compared to people with lighter skin tones. So partly that is the technology, and partly it's the quality of data and biases in data that it may be sort of fed on in the first place. So that is a problem with AI, data quality and bias, and that partly goes to the kind of garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good data, and if you've got biases in the data that is going into systems, well, you can expect the system itself to not be so robust and be biased in various ways. There are also issues, as I mentioned already, scraping data from the internet without permission, copyright and data protection sort of litigation going on about that at the moment. But for those in the academic world, which I think we all are, there are actually kind of interesting, but also I think kind of problematic new developments, specifically with regards to our publications. So Routledge, which is quite a well-known academic publisher, has recently signed an agreement with AI companies to use the publications that it publishes for the AI companies can use that content to train their algorithms and machine learning models, and they don't actually need to seek permission from the authors to do that, because as we discussed yesterday, when we sign an agreement with a publisher for our work, we tend to assign them the copyright. So they actually are probably legally able to enter into contracts, even though it's about our work, without our consent for that. So I actually, in some respects, you could say, well, scraping data from the internet without permission is kind of problematic, and it might well be actually an infringement of copyright. But I think we're increasingly seeing situations where actually there might not be a legal problem with this according to the laws that we have, but are we happy with our data or our content being used to train AI that we may not benefit from? And I think that's kind of where quite a lot of my work is now looking at, which is can be a legal problem, but I think is a more broad problem maybe of political economy and of politics, morals more generally about AI technologies. There are also a huge amount of problems with regards to data and the environment all over the world, in fact. So data and AI are not disembodied. I mean, they actually do have a kind of materiality to them in terms of the equipment that is used to process data, in terms of where the rare earth metals come from to process, to make that equipment, which includes things like cobalt mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo in some really terrible working conditions, as well as kind of the electricity too that is required to power the data centers that are needed to actually run artificial intelligence. So in fact, I think people are quantifying at the moment how much energy using ChatGPT actually requires. So if I should have looked this up before the talk, but in fact, if you actually put a query into ChatGPT, how much electricity is that costing? And even if that electricity is being generated on a renewable basis, there are still some kind of, in my opinion, can be some problematic implications of that. So for instance, like specifically in Scotland, we have actually a lot of renewable energy capacity. We're quite a small population with quite a large amount of land, but land is extremely, and maybe this resonates a bit in the South African context, I don't know, but land is increasingly, is held on a very concentrated basis. So there are very large landowners in Scotland, actually probably the most concentrated land ownership in Europe, and a very large amount of the land is actually owned by, well, billionaires essentially, and there's real issues around sort of community access to land for purposes of like rural communities in particular. So into this has come a wind farm. Into the scenario has emerged a wind farm that is being set up in a rural part of Scotland, which is going to power Amazon's data centers and only power their data centers. And it's I don't know if it actually says how big the amount of land is, but this is kind of already in a situation where there are issues over land ownership and concentration of land. And we have a lot of renewable energy capacity, but it's not equally accessible or working equally for the people as a whole. And not only is that the case, but then we have big tech giants who are needing to decarbonize their data centers, arguably exacerbating the problem. So I think there's a lot in there about data and the environment in terms of these developments and in terms of kind of the materiality of data and what that actually means. Absolutely in terms of the raw materials, in terms of the energy, and then kind of could that, and the land, frankly, and could that be kind of used for other purposes? Well, possibly yes, or the exacerbation of pre-existing problems. Okay, and then I think the question is really, is AI worth it? So is what is being produced by AI, who is kind of benefiting from AI, is it actually worth like all of these problems? And I think that's very much well, some of us probably have quite strong views on the matter, but I think it's one that it's not kind of for sure that AI is necessarily going to improve things overall. It's causing other issues, and at least in a very utilitarian way, do the costs outweigh the benefits, and who is also benefiting? So this is kind of where some of my work has been looking at with regards to the data itself. So I have looked, and as you can probably guess from the previous slide, I am very interested in the environmental aspects and the kind of political economy of the environmental aspects of data. But I'm probably going to focus a bit more now on kind of the immaterial data rather than the materiality of it. And I'm going to talk a bit about some work that in the next, 10 minutes before finishing up, and try to get through a few kind of insights from some work I've been doing from the more policy side to try and kind of influence government, which is not always very easy in itself, to kind of look in a bit more of a critical way at some of the data that is coming from the public and that may well be used for training AI models. So who is benefiting from it and who is paying for it? And can there be perhaps a more equitable outcome by looking at the kind of public nature of this data? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, there are various different sources for data that can train artificial intelligence. I'm going to talk very specifically about sources that are coming from the public, but particularly the public sector. And I think there is also a lot of data that is held about the public, which is held privately. So if we interact with social media, with WhatsApp or TikTok or whatever else, they're collecting lots of data about us too, but they are private companies. And I do a bit of work, and including in conceptualizing the public there, but I don't think I've got a good enough sort of findings or views to share at the moment on that, and B, I want to concentrate on the public sector data just because I've got not enough time and a few more concrete things to say about it. I think nevertheless there is a kind of question though about what does public mean here, and it's also kind of ideological as well, because different countries, even if we just look at the government and the public sector, different countries have kind of very different approaches to what goes on there and what is the public sector. I think, and one area that comes up a lot and that I work on quite a lot is in health, in terms of health data. So in the UK, there is a public healthcare system. There's a lot of issues with it at the moment, including around kind of the political economy of health, neoliberal policies around health, but it is a comprehensive public system that until very recently, almost the entire population has used in some shape or form. Now, I think that in South Africa, there is a public system, but a lot of people use private healthcare as well, especially if they're well off. So in the UK, we're going in that direction, I would say, unfortunately, but we have had a very kind of comprehensively used public healthcare system until very recently, and there's a lot of data kind of in there that is being used for training AI. But what I want to say, though, is that this is kind of ideological about how much does the government provide in terms of public services. Health, I think, is a good example, because also if you look at the US, it is a very private, it's not really a public service. It's very much, well, it's been contested, I suppose, but it's very much a kind of mainly privately provided service. So in some countries, you know, what is public and what is private, it really depends on kind of ideological decisions that are made about what the state should be providing. Okay, so on that basis, I guess I might just kind of talk about this one example, because this is one where kind of we worked quite extensively on looking at notions of the public and public data, as well as kind of providing recommendations about kind of how that might be better used, and kind of benefits that come from it might be better sort of apportioned. So during like 2022 to 2023, I chaired an independent expert group for the Scottish Government. Now, in the UK, we have like autonomous governments. So the Scottish Government is one of them, and it has various powers over, actually health is an example that we keep coming back to. So there's a kind of autonomy over the healthcare system, over education. So there's a different schooling system in Scotland compared to England. And there is actually also a separate legal system, but we don't need to go into that just now. So it's an autonomous kind of government that I don't think you have in South Africa. I think the provinces are not autonomous, or they are, I'm not sure. Certain aspects. Okay, because I do believe there was some discussion about more autonomy or federation in 1994, but it didn't quite happen. So in some European countries, you have these kind of autonomous governments. Spain is another example where, for instance, the government of Catalonia, where Barcelona is, has quite a lot of power over various things. In Belgium as well, for instance, there's autonomous governments too. So they sit below the kind of nation state level, and they have differing competences over areas of the public sector. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of explain that, so it's not the kind of UK government, it's kind of below that. So what the Scottish Government asked us to do, and I was chairing this group, was kind of convene a multi-stakeholder group of people from the public sector, the private sector, NGOs, civil society, and academia, to look into how data that is held by the public sector in Scotland, particularly in healthcare, is used at the moment and is accessed at the moment for research and innovation by companies, so the private sector, and how a more ethical approach to that issue could be sort of implemented to facilitate research and innovation with the private sector, but also to kind of safeguard, I guess, public values and the public good. So last year actually around this time exactly, we issued a final report, which is a kind of suggestions to the Scottish Government. So it's up to them to implement it or not, which included a policy statement, principles, and recommendations. And essentially what the link between this and artificial intelligence is that the data that is held by the Scottish public sector, particularly in healthcare, can be used by researchers, including from companies, to do research and potentially create kind of new innovations. And among these can be artificial intelligence in terms of new AI models. But it can also be things that are not artificial intelligence as well. So the link is kind of, this is the data that can then be used to train AI and do other things. It's data that comes from the public. It comes from their interactions with the government. A lot of it comes from the healthcare sector, and that is particularly valuable data. Kind of what happens next. So what has happened is that companies and others have been able to use that data, and they have actually been able to kind of create their own intellectual property based on innovating with that data and producing kind of new products and services. Often this has been in healthcare. I keep coming back to this. So for instance, pharmaceutical companies might access that data, use the data for work that they're doing around new vaccines or medications or treatments, or even new equipment as well. And what currently happens is that the public sector or the government does not co-own the intellectual property that is produced. What usually happens is that especially if it's healthcare, the company will sell their innovation to the healthcare system ostensibly at a lower price, because that, in recognition that they've needed to use the public data to make this, but it's not free. And there's also been criticism about they have often tried to inflate the prices to make it sound that their discount to the public sector is a good one, whereas actually they're still making kind of quite a lot of money, arguably, out of it and out of the public healthcare system with data they need access to from the public in the first place. So without access to the data from the public sector, there are questions about whether they would actually be able to create these innovations to begin with. So in our work, we were particularly, I guess, concerned about the public nature of this, or well, the public nature of the data, but also the extent to which the public actually knows that this is going on. Do they actually agree to this? Is there social license from the public? It is legal, what is happening, by the way, but it's more, is this ethical? And how could we sort of make this more ethical, acceptable, so that this is actually happening kind of in the public interest rather than in the private interests of companies in particular that are doing what I've just described. So there have also been sort of concerns. So companies don't actually have to pay to access the data, this kind of data. What they pay for, they might have to pay some kind of cost recovery for the people hours that it takes to kind of facilitate the access to the data, and some other costs that the public sector may incur to facilitate access to that data for research, but they don't actually pay, like a commercial, for the commercial value of the data. And for some people, the idea that our public data could be sold off to companies doesn't actually sound particularly palatable. However, if the reality is that companies are making money out of that data and are commercializing it, well, maybe we should actually be getting something more out of it. And whether that is, selling the data, or getting a commercial price for the data, or actually having something more coming back in financial terms if there's a commercial innovation, were things that we actually suggested as part of this work. So that and this should be something that kind of needs to involve the public in Scotland and in its diversity, as it is a diverse public, and kind of ensure that they understand what is happening, and that also these kinds of decisions about who is accessing the data and for what purposes are palatable to them, and are in the public interest. That is a public interest co-created with the public, and not just people in government, technocrats in government, elites of government that are deciding kind of on behalf of the public overall that a certain company should or should not access this data. So as a broad sort of policy statement, if financial sort of value is being created out of data, we think some of that should actually be shared back with the public sector and the public. And there is a mechanism that comes from another area entirely of traditional knowledge and genetic resources. Again, I'm sorry for being a bit legalistic, but there is a convention, the Convention on Biodiversity, which has a kind of mechanism along the lines that a nation state owns its own genetic resources. And if you are a pharmaceutical company or whoever else who is working with those genetic resources, and you make some kind of medication or whatever else with that, or an AI model, I guess, you should be sharing some of the benefits back with that country, and ideally with the communities in particular that those genetic resources come from. So that model is one that we, while imperfect, and those who work in that area would have a lot of criticism of it in practice, but the principle of like sharing back benefits with the people that the data actually comes from is something that we would like to see kind of adopted. That, for those who are also a bit more legally minded, benefit sharing doesn't necessarily involve sharing ownership over intellectual property. So it is more that if revenue comes in, then that maybe some of that revenue would be shared back. But essentially, I want to actually put forward that there would be shared intellectual property over innovations made with this data, but the private sector representatives in our group were not in favour of that at all. So it was a point of no, we didn't have consensus, so we didn't actually we didn't suggest it, but it's something that I think has not been properly considered, at least in the UK public sector, in terms of data has been made available, companies have commercialized it, got intellectual property over it, sold it back to the public sector, but they haven't really thought about shared ownership of that in the first place as a condition, for instance, for accessing the data in the first place. Okay, so what I would say from that is, and I might just kind of finish at this point, there were many kind of unanswered or points that we didn't actually have consensus across the group on, contentious things like intellectual property, ownership over innovations, including, for instance, AI models. And we also didn't really define in any detail what we meant by certain terms like public benefit and public interest. We did say things like they should be kind of co-defined with the public itself, rather than some policymakers who are actually kind of part of a political elite, at least in my country, kind of making decisions on behalf of the public about that. But essentially kind of notions about benefit and interest are kind of contested matters of political economy and really depend on kind of much broader ideological perspectives around things like where innovation comes from, what is the role of the private sector, what is the role of the public sector, limits on that, what should be encouraged in terms of being for the good of the public. So we didn't go into any detail on those terms, only to acknowledge that I think we are talking about big and contested matters of political economy here when it comes to data, and certainly when it comes to kind of AI as well. So who owns it, who is using it, for what purposes, in what circumstances. And in addition to this, when it comes to kind of data in the public sector, there was certainly this kind of imaginary on behalf of the government, I would say, that corporations should access this data and should be allowed to kind of create innovations with it, whether that might be co-owned by the government or not. There was this sort of strong perspective, at least unstated, but seeming to permeate this work, that innovation comes from the private sector and it doesn't come from the public sector. So we need to encourage that kind of innovation, and we shouldn't be putting too many kind of barriers in their way, which is a very kind of neoliberal approach, I would say, and one that is beginning to kind of be a bit more nuanced, but that seemed to be kind of a very strong ideological position that the government kind of took. So the very idea that we might say actually companies shouldn't access this data was kind of really not within their bounds of the imagination. There are also, I mean, I've talked a bit about the sort of, well, what I see anyway as the sort of regressive model or problematic model of company accesses data, makes innovation, gets IP, sells it back to the country, and the country maybe doesn't benefit from it or people don't benefit from it as they should be. But there are actually quite a few kind of more progressive models, particularly for data, that are emerging kind of in different parts of the world. So like data commons, data cooperatives, indigenous data sovereignty initiatives, which have been quite, I don't have time to go into these at the moment, but there are kind of alternative models, and we did sort of mention them and we recommended looking into them more because we did kind of want to see a more sort of democratic and at times participatory approach to, again, the model being sort of somebody in the government decides whether data is accessed or not. And other things that were sort of outside of the scope of our work were some of the hidden costs of data as well. So the infrastructures, the curations, the environmental costs that even having this data in the first place and facilitating access to it entails. And I think another kind of important aspect too is that even in the public sector in many countries, the data, like the services, the computers, the software that is being used, in itself is provided by the private sector. So Microsoft, Amazon Web Services are very prevalent in UK public administrations. And that is kind of like private sector provision of data and digital services, but that was kind of outside of our scope. That causes a whole lot of issues too. So issues around national security, if those systems are being provided by companies in foreign countries, as well as kind of issues around public trust as well. So large amounts of money are going to these companies to provide infrastructure for the public sector. But that was outside our scope. I think we kind of noted it, but we didn't kind of go into any detail on it. But I think this is sort of problematic overall. So I've got plenty more to say, but I don't have any time to say it. I'll just kind of finish. These have been some sort of concluding thoughts. And I think really, for me, the kind of key issue here is that if data from the public is creating value, and that is creating financial value, then maybe some of that value needs to be shared back in some way. And just making, for instance, drugs that are then, or innovations that are sold to the public healthcare sector, for me, is kind of not enough. And if we look at more the AI sort of example, just having like, you know, stable diffusion models that we can sort of play around with without paying for. But if all of our data is sort of going into that, is that really kind of enough? And I think the answer is no, as you can probably guess. But I think there's kind of bigger questions too around, you know, the uses of data, the creation of power, the positions of power, the data kind of leading to more power and imbalances in power as well, and that this is kind of has to be part of the broader discussions around kind of AI data, particularly when we have public data that might be leading to retrenching private power. And I think too, we need to think carefully about when data and AI shouldn't be used. So there's also been these kinds of, at least in my country, pushes towards sort of AI is going to solve lots of problems, more data, the merrier, that's going to help things. But actually there are, as mentioned, costs and situations where it may not be appropriate, and it may also be kind of leading to problematic outcomes. So I think this needs to be part of the discussion as well. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Have been on our mind, which you've laid them out so powerfully, and I'm sure that all of you have some thought of the questions around. So without further ado, if you please indicate if you like to ask a question or have a comment. These three. Can we start with three? So Claire can resume showing up this round. So 16 great. And what?
Oh, actually, we do need to move. I think a question online. We have to share the
Oh yeah, okay.
the thing. We don't have a very good system here, so have to. Oh, has it?
Not sure which button.
I think just to be just to make sure everyone online can hear.
And the question online as
You
well.
can just speak in its area. It's okay.
I don't know if there's a question online.
There was a comment, I think, that earlier when I'll get to that around nuclear power.
Yes, let me first say thank you very much indeed. I think it's important for us. I'm a retired sociologist, and my question isn't about the Magnificent Seven and the monopoly the Magnificent Seven have, but I think that should be part of the discussion. My question is about something completely different. My son sent me ChatGPT last year, and I decided I was going to force it to make a mistake. And then it made a mistake. I asked it, what were the BAABs in South Africa, ? BAABs were apartheid institutions outside of the Bantustans, outside of the homelands. It answered within 3 seconds, in 3 paragraphs. First paragraph correct, second paragraph correct, third paragraph dead wrong. It said that those organizations were inside rather than outside of the Bantustan. I felt good. I mean, I then took this to an ICT friend of mine, and he said to me, look, go back to ChatGPT. I'll help you. Inform ChatGPT of the nature of the mistake and ask ChatGPT for a better answer, which we did, and it immediately came back with 3 paragraphs, not longer, and it was a better answer. And this is a year and a half ago. A week ago, I went back to ChatGPT, 3.5. I'm not paying. And I asked ChatGPT the same question, and it gave me a correct answer, but a much longer one with issues on dimensions of the organization. So one can either say it learned or it improved, partially because of the way in which the users came back to it.
Exactly.
So the question is, should there not be a program whereby when data is seen to be biased, and that's difficult, or incorrect, which is factually incorrect, which is less difficult, that what should go back and from the outside increasingly improve I'm not talking about the data now, I'm talking about the way in which a new interpretation is fed into the statistical process. Should that not be an issue which we should really take in cognizance, that we the users can in fact in some way with certain issues to a certain scale improve the output of generative AI?
Great comment. Yeah, we'll do it around. But I think also then the question is on the people who are putting that information in, you're putting value into a system, who should only the company reap the benefit then of the labor, I guess. But Brett, you next.
Thank you, Angela. I thought it was brilliant. So as I have a question, I come from an IT background, and I've seen, sort of the effects AI has had in. It's interesting, because it was, early machine learning models were taught in a couple of gaming environments, because there was such, they could play themselves over and over and over and over again and learn. And, sort of since I would say the early 2020s, personally, again, it's my own perspective, I haven't really seen the benefits play out in the environment in which it was introduced. And I think it's kind of like, sort of intuitive, is that it's focused on the procedural, sort of procedural tasks. That's what it does really well. My question then is just, given the bias, in the world right now, especially in STEM, towards this kind of the optimization of procedures, do you think that the developments we're seeing are truly are they unstoppable, or do we have a chance? I'm just thinking in terms of what the cell phone has done to, the world. Is this even a phenomenon of course we can actually do anything about?
Thanks for that. It was actually quite interesting. On principle, I believe knowledge is for the public good. That's on principle, naturally. But every day, social media, what we do every day is to give our IP for free in one level. But at the core of the state, it's been the military, because Google and so on and other things. It's been around how certain knowledge is not even known. For example, I can't just say, hey, government, I need stats on how many guns you manufacture and for the sake of state security. So how do you balance then the narrative of a public good versus state security, which gets very privatized in various ways, in different ways? In terms of healthcare and education, you can argue that, but there are very serious questions of actually knowledge that we think we know, we don't, that are actually in the public good. So how do we deal with those questions that are very easily technically, they can be around state security, and therefore the public should not know about their own public state security questions in relation to this, that also, again, around the material, the money that runs around this militarized complex that we've seen, that is so privatized, but it's such a state project at the same time in different ways. So how do you deal with ownership there?
Right. Thanks so much for that round. I think I'll hand back to you to answer those very rich.
Yeah, thank you, and really tough questions as well. So I think again, so with the first kind of question, if I remember and understand and remember it well, I think this kind of, I'm kind of not going to answer it with a proper answer. I guess I'll just point to the problems, which is a classic academic thing to do, or the kind of problems that it raises. And I think we're kind of seeing this at the moment with regards to, well, do we want, ChatGPT to kind of, for instance, hoover up all of our, knowledge in the world, and we are, and also the labor that we are kind of using to sort of train it so that it is fully accurate in whatever it says? Or are there questions about whether, I suppose the questions are whether it shouldn't do that. If it doesn't do that, it gives inaccurate and misleading sort of information to people who may, unlike yourself, not know what the history or background is, and that's a problem. But then on the other hand, how does it sort of equitably, maybe that's the point, how does it equitably sort of address this? So do we just want ChatGPT, for instance, to hoover up all of our academic papers without our consent as authors, even though our publisher can consent on our behalf, and we don't really have much recourse? I mean, and I think it is about sort of the value. So who is creating the value? Who is expropriating the value or exploiting the value, and is the value being shared? And I guess they would sort of say, well, you get the free product, and therefore, it's also in our interest that ChatGPT is as accurate as it possibly should be. But I think these are the kind of questions that I think we're needing to deal with. Hopefully in this series, you can give me some more answers as well, but deal with at the moment. So, what are we trying to achieve maybe with these systems, and what are they trying to achieve, and what is the public's role in kind of making more money for them, or making them better systems? Because essentially you are training ChatGPT when you're critiquing the answers that it's giving, so it learns from your critiques and you get a better answer later on. But you were doing that for free, but then we get the service for free, so that they would say, well, you get it for free, so it's just desserts. But I think it's a problem. I'm not sure I've got the solution to it, but it is a problem. With regards to the next question, well, I mean, there's been this whole kind of hype cycle around AI recently. And as I was saying to somebody in law the other day, I mean, for those probably more like yourself more than me, who probably knows much more about it, there's been these kind of cycles of hype and around AI for actually decades, about kind of, it's not actually a new, some of these aspects, particularly around, like, I think the adaptability and autonomy of systems and the lack of sort of predictability, are new, and we also have much more computing power now than we used to, which brings up all the problems that I mentioned around the costs of that. But there have been these kind of cycles of hype in the past, and actually my own PhD supervisor was one of the early people working on like law and AI, and when I was doing my PhD, we thought that was kind of old hat at that point in time, like 10-15 years ago, but now it's obviously not anymore, and his work has come back into fashion, I suppose. So we've seen the hype cycles before. If you do read things like, I don't know if people read them much here, but like the Financial Times or The Economist, there's been articles recently about the hype cycle and about, AI is not necessarily living up to what the finance people kind of expected for it. There's been all this kind of flurry of investment in startups and all the rest of it, particularly in the US. But I think the questions now are like, is it actually, what are we using it for? Is it useful? Is it is it as transformative as like mobile phones and the internet have been? It's hard to know. I also, not being a kind of finance nor technical person, but I would sort of say maybe, I think the killer application for AI is not clear at the moment. I do know that people do use things like ChatGPT, for instance, in business to like read legal contracts and give them a summary of what it actually means in like normal language without having to pay a lawyer. I think there's also issues in banking jobs in sort of finance and trading might be automated. But for kind of society as a whole, I don't think the benefits of AI are entirely clear at the moment. And but having said all of that, like in the UK with the new government coming in, there's been renewed hype around also AI as solutionism, sort of AI is going to solve our problems in our public health sector, which are actually not really, in my view, AI problems to solve. They're problems around a lack of investment, around stealth privatization over the last 15 years around an aging population with more disease, inequality in society. So AI is not, I don't think AI is going to solve this, but there are those who are kind of saying like, we just need to kind of have more AI in the system and that will help all these problems. But I think it's incredibly naive, and also there's a cost to that too. AI isn't free, even, and as I've mentioned, you know, it can be trained on public data and then sold back to the public system. So as you can probably imagine, I'm quite skeptical about a lot of this, but there are some, I do understand there are some kind of good uses of it, but for the general public and society, but so far not that many, I think. And sorry, and as regards like the next point, in some ways I think that was the most difficult point for me, just to sort of say that at least the political economy of the militarization of AI and its sort of military engagement is something that was raised quite recently. Again, I'm maybe a bit parochial, only talking about my own context, but it's been raised sort of in the Scottish context, because the Scottish government, I didn't mention, also does have a kind of AI strategy. So it also wants more AI, but military and defence is something that is still dealt with by the UK over government centrally. So it doesn't have power over that. But essentially, you know, there was a critique by this, I think he is actually a sociologist, in fact, Dan McQuillan. I mentioned his book to Lloyd. He's written a book about kind of AI from a very sort of critical perspective, but he wrote this piece about Scotland's AI strategy, actually, and he's English, so it's interesting that he knew about it. But he basically said it's not going to achieve what the government may want it to. Like, it's not good to, it has this environmental impact. It's coming from US companies. It's not going to kind of increase the sovereignty. So I'm answering your question more with regards to sovereignty. It's not something that our government, even if we were an independent country, would, according to its strategy, it's not going to achieve sort of sovereign technology. So you are kind of buying technology that is being developed by the US military and tech companies, and that's kind of, so your AI strategy is certainly not going to, it might help have more AI in society, but there are questionable benefits to that, but you're actually kind of going to relinquish some national sovereignty with regards to where it comes from. So having said all of that, I mean, I guess your question was also more about the public good. I do think why I mentioned that, because I think this does talk about the public, or speak to the public good in a more broad sense. And probably even I would have to admit that military and defence is part of the public good, as problematic as it can be. And especially, like, for instance, in the European perspective, you know, there's been a lot of concern around sovereignty and defence with the situation in Ukraine recently in a way that wasn't maybe in the recent past. So those considerations have to be part of at least what government takes into account. But there are also aspects maybe that are not related to parts which require secrecy, and we could at least have a discussion about whether AI should be used or not. Is it in the public good? Is it being created in the public good? But that, my point, I guess, that I was trying to make is I think that's a fundamentally ideological discussion, and we can't sort of, in some ways, I do see in some policies, even the public benefit, public good rhetoric being raised without wanting to get into that discussion. But I think we kind of have to, if we want to discuss what is in the public good or not, basically.
You can unmute yourself, Lloyd, maybe you first, and then off.
Okay, can you hear me, Claire?
Yes.
Sorry, my voice is a bit croaky. Angela, thank you. That was fantastic. This is all very, very interesting and stimulating. In my inbox, I have a string of emails sort of on an ongoing basis from Gary Marcus, who's a rather interesting technologist and critic of new AI technologies generally. And he is currently very active in the whole debate around what's called SP 1047, which is the California AI law. I'm not sure. It's not important that I think that you know much about this, but my question relates to this, the kind of pattern that we see emerging here, and what I would frame in terms of the potential for some form of legal activism. Because the tendency here, of course, is for all these big companies like OpenAI to say yes, so you appear before Congress or Senate or whatever and say regulation is important, and then save the import at the very last minute, and then just water down laws like this to practically nothing. And the argument, of course, always is this kind of neoliberal argument that, well, the technology is too advanced for law to keep track of. Law is a blunt instrument, and we're going to stifle innovation, blah blah blah. So my question is, given situations like this, which are going to reoccur everywhere, what do you see as the potential for more activist kind of legal work on this? And with something like, for example, like the Convention on Biodiversity, which you mentioned, which is very interesting, would that present a kind of a model for other more call them geospecific or cultural types of data?
Thanks, should we have the other question, or do you want me to answer? Okay.
Oh, okay. Hi. I wanted to just ask something more in terms of law specifically, and technology. So I mean, a large part of a lawyer's job is obviously legal research, right? And understanding legal concepts, and then finding, precedents, public records, prior decisions, and so on, court decisions. I mean, very useful if you can get a record of a case that's very similar to your client. If you can find that it's a precedent, you get a powerful argument, and so on. And this is what you pay for, and what you charge for, because that job is hard. You must interpret legal jargon, and of course, just having access to all these records and filtering through it, packs and stacks of text. But as far as I know, this is public goods. These records are public goods. So can an AI bot trained on these public goods perhaps do a lot of this kind of research? And it could become a lot cheaper for people who can't afford this kind of
I think you muted yourself now.
might have been. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So to wrap it up, a lot of this is just around complexity and volume. That's what lawyers work with, of the law, and legal precedents. And I'm thinking AI could be actually very, very good at this. But would that be legal? Would it be okay? Would it be legal to give an AI training on this, since it's public information, public records and so on? That's what I was thinking in those lines. Yeah, maybe it's a bit of a scare for lawyers in a way.
Can I pass this just one? Yeah, sure. That's fine. Me too. Way at the back.
Thank you. Hello. So I am doing some research now for my master's on plant poaching, and I recently interviewed someone who is working on building an AI-powered tool to assist in finding people or finding plants that people have poached from the wild by identifying them via specific characteristics. And for me, it brought up this question of how AI might affect the future if prosecutions and if arrests can be made based on evidence that was found by AI, and what a world might look like where people can be arrested based on something that a robot or that like an AI has found.
Thanks, really all great questions actually across the board. So I guess these are the more law questions then. So firstly, with regards to Lloyd's question around sort of, I guess, legal activism around this area. Well, I have to say I regret to say I'm not so familiar with the Californian law because frankly it's so time consuming just to keep up with what's going on in the UK and European Union in my work. So I've unfortunately neglected a bit what's been going on in the US. But as mentioned, you know, the EU's AI Act is coming in. And when these things are formed in the European Union, also data protection laws, the General Data Protection Regulation, they have encountered an immense amount of lobbying by big business, including big tech companies, and absolutely to kind of influence the laws in ways that are going to be kind of palatable to those companies. And I suppose one could say that you do need to have laws that are workable. And if you just have legislatures making laws that don't really engage with those who have to implement them, especially in quite a highly technical way, then that's not great. I mean, they can just end up with things that are not really workable. But then the kind of flip side of that is the influence that lobbyists can have. And this is kind of becoming an increasing issue in the European Union. We would say Brussels for short, but in Brussels, where the European institutions are, there's an immense amount of lobbying, and it's not clearly just from big tech. It's also big pharma and oil and gas and mining and all the rest of it, depending on the area. So that is definitely an issue. I suppose you could say that the laws do need to be workable, but there is kind of maybe not enough accountability, perhaps, because also these legislative bodies in Europe are very technocratic as well, which taps into a much bigger can of worms around democratic deficits in Europe that I won't go into. But I spent quite a bit of my own PhD actually kind of unpicking this adage that the law is sort of always behind technology. I think it's something that's very neoliberal actually, and has been very much the kind of state, at least in like Western Europe and the US, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the 1990s onwards, that technology should not be or innovation has to occur without regulation, or regulation will stifle innovation, whereas actually regulation can shape the kinds of innovation that we want, or that is desirable or is in the public good or whatever else. But again, I think it's a deeply kind of ideological position. Now, that's not to say that lawyers and judges and parliamentarians are not, some of them genuinely don't understand technology very well and, you know, don't see the problems until it's too late and all the rest of it. But there's sometimes this kind of inevitability or determinism that law must always follow technology. And I think that's our regulation. And I think that's kind of something that's actually a very ideological position that I tried to unpick in some of my earlier work. But with regards to kind of legal activism, actually, I'll talk about the bots as well. So there have been, like, I don't know so much about legislation because I think me as the jury anyway on the EU AI Act is a bit out at the moment because, well, for various reasons. But there have been kind of more sort of activism in the sense of taking cases and complaints about AI and about AI companies, at least in the UK and Europe, with regards to areas like data protection law, privacy, which is privacy, by the way, to some extent maybe with IP law, although that's probably more in the US. And actually, going back to facial recognition, there's been litigation against police use of facial recognition in England and Wales on the basis of the facial recognition technology being not compliant with data protection law, so privacy, but also because of the potential biases and the police not properly fulfilling their duties under anti-discrimination law to ensure that the technology was not biased on a racial and gender basis. And in short, I mean, these cases are always very complex. The courts did decide that that particular use by the police of facial recognition technology in public areas did not comply fully with data protection law and anti-discrimination law, but it wasn't as if they said there should be a blanket ban on facial recognition use. They sort of said you need to make sure you do it right and then you can use it. So I think if we do actually go to the discussions around bias, then you could sort of correct for bias so that the technologies are not biased anymore. But is this still a desirable thing to roll out in, for instance, like poor communities, which is what the police were doing, to the general public? Like, is that appropriate? Is it ethical or not, even if the technology isn't biased? So I think there are these kind of bigger questions that remain, but there have been some interesting cases. I guess that's what I wanted to point to. And I think there will continue to be, as I said to your colleagues in law, there's been an enormous amount of litigation in Europe around issues like privacy. There's quite a kind of activist base around that. And there's been a kind of understanding that some of the tools that are in the law can actually be used kind of quite interestingly and effectively, including in areas like employment and including by trade unions against employers that might, I mean, can go into more detail on that perhaps another time. But I think there's been a recognition that data issues can actually be kind of a tool, or litigating these as data issues can be a tool to achieving other things, which might well be kind of redress of the imbalance of power with regards to employers and employees, for instance. So it's something to kind of watch and see, because I don't think there's been litigation in some of these issues in South Africa, for instance, which people said there just really wasn't very much on these areas. So, okay, that's some of the activist stuff. I hope that's kind of, I know you asked about convention and biodiversity, and I might kind of pass on that for now, just in the interest of time. But to say, yeah, I think there are issues around sort of traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge that might be kind of caught up in AI systems. And certainly Indigenous communities in Australia that I'm more familiar with, they have a lot of like secrecy around some of their knowledge. And so the idea that an AI system that like OpenAI or ChatGPT would just sort of eat up all of their knowledge is really kind of culturally totally inappropriate and kind of against their own traditional laws as well. However, having said that, there's been kind of an interesting development in New Zealand. Maori, I think a small language model for the Maori language that has been created with Maori communities is kind of a counter example to some of the big AI behemoths. But I will not go any more into traditional knowledge there, just to maybe agree that there are problematic aspects of that also being sort of hoovered up. Okay, with regards to kind of like bots that might, actually produce or improve access to the legal system and access to justice, there have been some examples of this. It's not more so much around kind of legal research or questions that are kind of not very clear from the precedents, because probably that AI systems, at least that are kind of used in the legal field, aren't good enough at doing that yet. And it seems to still require humans, which is good for us. We can still teach law students to do that for the time being. But more of these kind of bots have been used to sort of facilitate like complaints processes, or to simplify them, or help people. I don't know if there's distinction between in this sense in South Africa, but in the UK you have like kind of simplified court procedures for small claims, so for kind of smaller amounts of money, and some of the employment tribunals are supposed to be simplified procedures as well, so you don't actually need to have a lawyer involved to kind of access them. The reality is that some of them are still very complex and you may still want to have a lawyer, but there have been kind of bots created that sort of help people access these supposedly accessible procedures, and some of them, and also do things like contest fines, and some of them seem to have been pretty successful and actually seem to be legal. But if a bot was claiming to give legal advice, that's probably illegal under sort of the regulations around practicing lawyers. So it's more in things that are quite procedural and just might be a bit difficult for ordinary people to navigate, rather than questions that, but the kind of, it's more like a factual issue rather than a big question of like, what is the law on this? There's a kind of unclear precedent. So we aren't really seeing AI dealing with that at the moment so far. And so hope that kind of answers that question. And just with regards to the last one, which is a really good question around evidence. So this is actually, I've got a joint appointment at the University of Dundee between a centre on forensic science and the law school, which is my kind of disciplinary home. And that it's something that we talk about in the Forensic Science Centre, is kind of evidence, digital evidence, which is not necessarily that well understood or dealt with by courts at the moment, and then kind of what sort of AI systems, if we were to take evidence from AI systems, what would the forensic people need to know about, or the forensic experts need to understand about the system in order for that evidence to be kind of admissible and robust and potentially challenged, especially if the systems themselves don't, well, may have, well, all systems have flaws. So how would that kind of, how could evidence be produced in ways that were robust? This is getting a bit out of my area because it becomes a bit more technical, but I would say from the legal perspective, we don't actually have particularly good ways of assessing digital evidence at the moment. And it actually has given rise to like a huge miscarriage of justice in the UK around the operation of a financial computer, financial software in our post offices, where it was producing errors that were then leading to prosecutions of staff members, some up for fraud, and actually the system was at fault. But part of this kind of polycrisis in our institutions is that the courts and the legal system was not particularly good at sort of assessing the robustness of that evidence, or even asking the right questions about that evidence. And in fact, in England and Wales, they have a presumption in the court system that that computer systems function properly. Which anyone who uses a computer system will know that that is not the case. But that presumption then meant there was a kind of evidentiary barrier. The defendants had to show that the system wasn't functioning properly, and there was a whole lot of actually very bad and serious issues around getting that evidence. But the system, I think, already doesn't adequately understand digital evidence. And I don't think it's so much different in other jurisdictions, by the way, and that's already led to very bad kind of problems even before we have AI. So it is a challenge, one that some of the forensic science community is trying to address, but it is a challenge. Okay.
Thank you so much. That's the end of the seminar. So we don't have time for another round of questions, but I'm sure if you would like to continue any discussion with Angela, you can get her email address, and we should run for a few more days.
Well, tomorrow is unfortunate, or okay, here in Stellenbosch just tomorrow, yes.
Okay, but sure, you know, we can use the digital technologies. Lloyd, would you like to have a last word to end off the seminar? Things that it was your series.
Just a tremendous thank you to Angela. I think this was a great start, really, really interesting. And thank you, Claire, for handling it.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming, and
Yeah, thanks for me. And yeah, absolutely happy to kind of, if anyone wants to speak to me now or get my email and continue the conversations, very happy to do so and hear more from you as well. So thanks.
just check. Okay.